We all want to make a great movie. As creatives, we focus on the script, the cast, the shots, the sound, and what it will feel like to see our film on the big screen. But almost nobody talks about what actually happens when you're on set and in production. Because producing an indie film is not just about being creative. It's about surviving problems you did not see coming, protecting your movie from bad decisions, and making difficult choices when things go wrong and hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars are on the line. So today I want to talk about 5 things nobody tells you about producing an indie film. And if you're trying to get your first film made, these are the lessons you want to learn before production, not after. Number 1, not everyone on your set is there to support your vision. Everyone's excited to finally be on set. It's what we all want to do. But one of the first things nobody tells you is that a lot of the people you hire are not nearly as invested in your vision on set as they appeared to be during prep. They're just there to do a job, and sometimes they think they should be doing yours. When you're making a lower budget indie film, especially without the structure of a big union production, people often do not stay in their lane. Everybody has an opinion. Everybody thinks they know better. Everybody wants to tell you how they would have done it because they're more than likely an aspiring director themselves. And sometimes they're not just giving feedback. They're slowing you down. They're challenging decisions. They're creating drama, and they're making the day harder than it needs to be. When people are trying to get hired, everyone says the right thing. I'm a team player. I'm used to long days. I'll do whatever it takes. Then you get on set and suddenly people are complaining because you're 5 minutes over, or they're questioning every decision, or they're creating tension when you're already under pressure. And they don't see any problem with that because for them, it's just a job. But when production wraps, most of them go home and you're the one who has to live with the film forever. If the film doesn't work because the day falls apart and you missed the big shot, or for whatever reason you just don't get what you need, you're the one carrying that consequence. So as a producer, you have to be willing to make hard decisions. Sometimes that means replacing somebody or shutting down the drama immediately. Sometimes being nice to one difficult person can hurt an entire movie. Like, nobody wants to be harsh and no one wants to fire people. That's often what it takes to get the movie made. In fact, my business partner, Mark Klebanoff, has made over 20 films in his career, and he says he has never produced a movie where he didn't eventually have to fire somebody. 20 films. It's just the reality. It's one of the hardest parts of the job, but if someone is standing between you and making the best movie possible, protecting the film has to come first. Number 2, something will always happen that you are not prepared for. No matter how prepared you are, something will always go wrong. Always. Locations can fall through, weather can destroy your schedule, actors can become unavailable, departments go over scope, transportation can fall apart, people can try to renegotiate when you're already in production. We've seen productions disrupted for reasons you could never predict. Mark has tons of stories like this, where location owners tried to renegotiate after they were already shooting. He's had transportation problems threaten an entire production day. He's even had a crew member create a problem over what was served for lunch. The point is, production doesn't usually fall apart because you plan poorly. It falls apart because anything and everything can happen and it doesn't care about your schedule. By the time these issues show up, you've already committed. You're in the battle and you can't stop till it's over. You have to finish the film, whatever it takes. But once you're in the middle of production with everything on the line, you don't always have good options. So if a location owner suddenly wants more money, you can say we have a signed agreement, but it may not matter because if you're standing there with your cast, your crew, your equipment, and the schedule all built around that location mid-shoot, you have a problem because you have to solve this now or risk losing multiple days of shooting to find someplace new. So being flexible is always needed. Producing isn't about avoiding problems, it's about solving them. Mark was sharing on his film, Prisoner of War, he had planned the entire schedule around shooting exterior scenes first before the rainy season got worse. But instead, the weather completely flipped his schedule. They had to think fast and rebuild sets on the soundstage and rearrange the shoot. They burned through their contingency far faster than expected, but at least they had a contingency to cover them. You need it on every film too. In a perfect world, you would have 10% of your budget set aside for emergencies. But a lot of indie films are bootstrapped, so you may not have that much to set aside, because the question is not, will something go wrong? The question is, what will you do when it does? Producing is not about having a perfect plan. Producing is about being able to adapt when the plan gets punched in the face. Number 3, on things nobody tells you about, a lot of your budget will not go on screen. This is one of the biggest surprises for new filmmakers. You raise money for the film, you imagine that money going in cast, location, production design, cinematography, stunts, action and everything the audience will actually see. But a huge amount of money does not go on screen. It goes to things like fees, bonds, insurance, interest, financing costs, union requirements, sales commissions, delivery costs, legal, post-production, overages, and if you don't know all that going into it, your budget can become a fantasy. For example, if you're working with SAG talent, you're not just paying the actor's fee, you're also paying pension and health on top of that. And if you're borrowing against a tax credit or rebate, you're not receiving the full amount free and clear, someone's cash flowing it, and that costs money. And if a sales agent is involved, they will eventually take something like 15 to 20% off the top. If your visual effects go over scope, that money has to come from somewhere. Mark has experienced that situation himself. On one of his films, his visual effects went so far over budget that he actually had to cash out his own crypto just to finish the movie. That's the reality of producing. Unexpected costs don't magically disappear. Somebody has to solve the problem. So when filmmakers do simple math like my movie costs this and I'll get this much back and then investors get paid, they're often missing the real costs. That's why your budget has to be built strategically with all of this in mind, not just hope. You need to know what money is going on screen and what money is simply required to get the movie made, finished, sold, and delivered. Because if you do not account for these costs, they don't disappear. They just show up later when you have fewer options. Number 4, you need a distribution plan before you make the movie. A lot of filmmakers make the movie first and think about distribution later. That is a mistake. You don't need to know the exact distributor on day one, but you do need to know what kind of movie you're making, who it's for, what the realistic path to market is, and what the film can actually justify financially. Too many filmmakers build their budget around creative desire instead of market reality. They think, this is a great story, so it deserves this budget. But the market doesn't care what you think your film deserves. The market cares about things like cast, genre, audience, packaging, timing, and commercial viability. And this is why filmmakers get stuck. They spend years developing a movie that can't support its own budget. And they spend a year chasing festivals, and by the time they go to distributors, the movie's already considered old in the marketplace. Now, festivals can be valuable, but the festival circuit is not a distribution plan. And Netflix is not waiting around for your phone call. Streamers are not automatically going to take your movie just because you believe in it. And getting into theaters is not always the win people think it is. Mark has watched filmmakers spend thousands of dollars recutting their movie after festivals because someone convinced them it would lead to a better deal. In reality, nothing they were changing was going to move the needle. Sometimes the hardest decision is realizing your movie is finished and then making the best business decision instead of chasing perfection to try and get a better deal. Sometimes a theatrical release can be good for visibility. That doesn't mean that it's the most profitable path. Sometimes being on a recognizable platform sounds impressive, but the deal itself may not actually be good for you or your investors. Mark had a filmmaker insist on taking a Netflix deal that he advised against because that filmmaker wanted the prestige of saying their movie was on Netflix. But a year later, they were asking how to get out of the deal because they realized prestige doesn't pay investors back and it wasn't a great deal. And this is exactly why we created the complete indie film producer system. Because most filmmakers are taught how to write scripts, direct actors, and make movies. They're rarely taught how successful producers evaluate projects, identify risks, secure financing, and determine whether a film actually makes sense before money gets spent. How to position projects for financing, distribution, and how they avoid expensive mistakes that can derail a film before it ever reaches an audience. Because that's the difference between a project that sounds exciting and a project that's actually fundable and designed for success. So if you'd like to see what it looks like to work with us, you can click the first link in the description below. So this business is really a series of decisions. The decisions you make before production determine the options you'll have after production. So before you make the movie, ask, what is the realistic distribution plan? Who is the audience? What does the marketplace currently want? What budget actually makes sense for this type of film? What kind of cast or elements does this film need to be viable? If you figure that out early, you give your film a much better chance. If you ignore it, you're kind of gambling. Number 5, on things no one tells you about, people will overpromise connections, praise, and opportunities. Nobody tells you how much of this business runs on smoke. Everybody knows someone. Everyone is best friends with somebody important. Everybody has a connection to a major actor, studio, an executive, a streamer, a financier, or someone who can make it happen. Most of the time, it means nothing. Even if the connection is real, that doesn't mean the person's gonna read your script or finance your movie, or they're gonna attach themselves to the project. It doesn't mean they're gonna save you or your project. Mark has heard people tell him they're best friends with major stars, studio execs, and powerful producers hours more times than he can count. It's usually meant to signal that they're important and they can help get a project moving, but then months later, nothing ever happens. This industry is full of people selling access they don't actually have. So you have to be very careful about building your film around vague promises. The same is true with praise. If someone tells you your script is brilliant, ask yourself whether there's a payday in it for them, because the same script can get completely different reactions depending on whether people think it's going somewhere and whether they think they can be involved. If it's just a script, people will sometimes pick it apart, but if it's greenlit, suddenly everybody wants to be attached. But the funny part is nothing changed about the script. Only people's perception of it changed. Success has a way of making everyone suddenly believe in something they ignored yesterday. And that's why you can't build your decisions around flattery. You need truth tellers, paperwork, and real commitments. You need people who will be honest with you before you spend the money, not people who tell you what you want to hear after it's too late. That's why you can't build a movie around promises, praise, or handshake. And yes, that includes friends. One of the most expensive lessons Mark ever learned came from trusting someone without getting paper. He spent nearly a year developing a project only to have it taken away because nothing was in writing. He eventually made a different version of the movie years later, but the lesson stuck with him forever. Get things in writing, even with people you trust. Not because you're trying to be difficult, but because clarity protects everyone. Producing an indie film isn't just about getting the movie made, it's about protecting the movie through every stage. You have to protect it from bad assumptions, from people who overpromise, from budget mistakes. You have to protect it from your own creative blind spot. And you have to be able to make decisions under pressure when there's no perfect option. That's the part nobody tells you. The dream is real, the highs are real. There are moments when it all feels worth it, but the lows are real too. Mark has had opening nights where almost nobody showed up to the theater, only to watch the same film eventually reach hundreds of thousands of viewers online. He's had projects fall apart after years of work, and others come together when he least expected it. That's producing. You keep solving problems, you keep making decisions, and eventually those decisions become your career. And the filmmakers who survive are not always the most talented. They're the ones who learn how the business actually works before it costs them everything. So if you're trying to produce your first film, don't just ask, how do I get this made? Ask, how do I build this so it has the best possible chance of actually working? Because that is the difference between making a movie and producing one. If this video was helpful, take a second to like the video and subscribe. On this channel, we focus on the practical side of funding, distribution, producing, and packaging films so you can stop guessing and start making smarter decisions. Drop your comments and questions below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.